Let's get the initial thoughts of our panel then on the challenges and opportunities now facing humankind. And if I can start with you, David Miliband, challenges certainly. Are there any opportunities in your book?
Yes, there are always opportunities because the world has more resources than at any time in human history to tackle the problems and address the opportunities of a connected world. I think the central lesson of the COVID crisis is that our connected world suffers from disconnected government. And the holes in the global safety net that we've seen both in the advanced industrialized countries, but also in the developing world, I think point to the areas where we will find solutions. I agree with Neil Ferguson that this is not a short-term crisis. It's a medium to long-term change in the way we run the planet. And it's incumbent on leaders in business, in NGOs, but also in government to rise to the challenge.
Well, we're going to get into a lot more of that during the course of this hour. So, Mary Robinson, some people are saying business as usual is the best we can hope for. Is that setting the bar too low?
Very much so, yes. Business as usual wasn't bringing us to a good place because we were heading for a climate crisis we were not taking seriously. So I think we can learn a lot from the terrible, sudden, dramatic downturn of COVID-19. It has upset our world. It has cost lives. It has cost livelihoods. It is not equal. It's not a great leveler. It's actually exacerbated all the inequalities. But it has taught us a few important lessons. First of all, that human behavior generally matters. That's what's protecting us from the virus. It's the collective behavior of people complying with the lockdown, with the social distancing, with the hand washing, etc. Secondly, science matters. Thankfully, we've been listening to the health experts. We were not listening enough to the climate scientists, to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which told us in October 2018, we had to reduce by 45% carbon emissions by 2030 to have any chance of a future for our children and grandchildren. Think of it. And we were not listening. So the other thing is government matters. That's really very interesting. And if I may, since I'm the only woman on this program, just to say, it's actually interesting that women-led governments have done well. We've had Angela Merkel in Germany. We've had the prime ministers of Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Finland. We've had Jacinda Ardern, who was briefly on your screen, in New Zealand. We've had the president of Thailand. All of them took tough decisions quickly for their people and then brought their population along with them in a way that was important. And so government matters. And then the last thing I would say is compassion matters. And this, I think, is something that would be, really very important going forward. We need to have an empathy for the suffering of others. We need to have a solidarity with the suffering of others. And I've no doubt that this is something that would greatly appeal in many ways, to what, in particular, what David Miliband was saying. We need to care.
OK, well, Mary Robinson, an awful lot we're going to expand on during the course of the hour, as I say. But Neil Ferguson, I want to get your sense of what history tells us about a global crisis like this as being an impetus for change.
Well, I'm not sure that it's necessarily always an impetus for the kind of change that you might want. Historically, pandemics have been disruptive of international as well as domestic order. Indeed, it was one of the striking features of the history of ancient Rome that pandemics posed almost as big a threat to the stability of the empire as invading barbarians. I think it's important to take a long, hard look at what happened to our international order when this pandemic arose. I'm very glad Ambassador Liu is on this show because, let's face it, China has some very difficult questions to answer about what happened in Wuhan back in December and in the early part of January. There's very compelling evidence to suggest that China reacted much too slowly and took far too long to recognize and admit the extent of the problem. in Hubei province, indeed acted far too late in imposing a ban on travel from Hubei only on January 23rd, more than 3 weeks after it was clear there was something very seriously wrong. So I think the first question that we need to address is the future relationship, really, between the West and China. The second point I think that needs to be addressed is whether globalization is now really over as a phenomenon. It's been in crisis really since 2008, the financial crisis. And this has dealt another blow to the whole notion of international supply chains extending all around the world and increasing the dependency of economies on each other. The fact that the United States is so reliant on China for pharmaceuticals came as quite a shock to people in the US. And finally, it's a striking thing that Mary Robinson didn't mention the most successful female leader of all, which is President Tsai of Taiwan, the country that actually probably handled the pandemic most successfully, despite being in very close proximity to the People's Republic of China. And I'll end by observing that Taiwan is probably potentially an even bigger flashpoint in the international order than Hong Kong, as relations between the United States and China deteriorate. It's been a really striking feature of this year that what I called Cold War II last year seems only to have intensified in the face of the pandemic.
Well, we're going to tease out a lot of these issues. As I say, we've got in television terms quite a long time to discuss all this. So, Ambassador, I want to start with you by asking you, because of the questions posed by Neil Ferguson and so many others around the world about China's role, first of all, in coronavirus and not telling the world about it soon enough and perhaps not reacting soon enough. I'm sure you may disagree with that. But the overall question is, does China therefore have a special responsibility to the world to improve it, to try to make things better now?
I think there's a lot of debate these days about what the consequences of this pandemic, whether the pandemic will unite the world or make the world more divided. I tend to believe it make the world more united. I think this pandemic really shows us again that we all belong to this global village. Just as the presidency said, you know, we should all try to build this shared community of shared future for mankind. I think this pandemic shows us that international community should cooperate. It shows that those countries who supported each other, who support WHO, play a leading role, who support multilateralism, and who listen to the advice of WHO, are able to put the virus under control. And those countries who reject international cooperation, who reject WHO advice, has paid high price. And I think no country, no matter how strong you are, you cannot be immune. You cannot be insulated from this pandemic.
Okay.
Virus respect borders, virus respect no race. I have some,
Ambassador, I'm going to cut across you because we do have an awful lot of time to discuss these issues. I wanted you all to set out your stalls. You're talking about global cooperation. We'll be testing China's commitment to that during the course of the evening, because I want to bring in the first question from our virtual audience. First up is Louis Carmichael from London. Very good to hear from you, Louis. Can you please pose your question to our panel?
Thank you, Dermot. Yes, good evening, everybody. I'd like to return to Mr. Ferguson's kind of first point, and I'd like to kind of know what kind of global fallout might we expect after COVID once investigations are underway and questions start to be asked of nation states, particularly China and the US. OK, well, Louis, you wanted to put that first then to Neil Ferguson. Professor Ferguson, then Louis asked what kind of global fallout might occur after this. Are we in a delicate situation?
I think we are. I mean, I think one has to recognize that the World Health Organization didn't exactly cover itself in glory back in January. It took far too long to acknowledge the seriousness of the crisis. And I think there are legitimate questions to be asked about its closeness to the government in Beijing. But I don't want to give the impression that the fault entirely lies with China. I think all the really big entities in the world have, in their different ways, performed badly. There are clearly diseconomies of scale because the United States grotesquely mishandled the crisis, dithering around through January, February, and into March, and leaving it far too late to take the kind of actions that had been very successful in countries such as Taiwan and South Korea. And the European Union did rather poorly as an institution in the first phase of the crisis, though things have somewhat improved since then. There was a distinct atmosphere of sauve-qui-peut back in January and February when it seemed for a time that the Germans weren't even going to allow the export of emergency medical supplies to Italy. So I think it's very interesting to see how the big players in the international order have underperformed, and also that some of the international institutions like the WHO didn't really do the job that was expected of them. I think the small players actually come out as having performed best. If you look at a league table of countries that handled the crisis really well, I've mentioned Taiwan, it's very near the top. New Zealand, and it should also be said, Australia have coped much better than other English-speaking countries we could mention. Israel has done notably well. And it begins to look as if small is beautiful in the sense that if you're trying to cope with a crisis of the sort that we've just seen, having a really efficient pandemic preparedness plan that actually works, that means large-scale testing early on and contact tracing. This seems to have come much more easily to these small, nimble countries, especially those like Taiwan and Israel that know they're in an insecure environment. So I think that's one important lesson to take away from this, that in some ways it's been a great advert for small nimble governments and not a very good one for big ones.
OK, well, let's talk a bit about the small ones and the big ones with David Miliband. And David Miliband, just to get it back to Louis' question, he's worried or wants to know what you see as being the potential global fallout from all this. Now, of course, the Ambassador Lou's been telling us, well, it's going to be global cooperation. Does it really look that rosy to you?
Well, I think that Louis' question needs a historical perspective. And I thought that Neil Ferguson would have said that we have some historical parallels. We know that after 1918, a world which retreated behind its walls, in which nationalism took root, ended in disaster. We also have a counterexample after 1945, when the rights of individuals were put alongside the rights of states as the foundation of the international system, and produced, despite the Cold War, a long period of growing peace and prosperity, although there were plenty of outbreaks of conflict and poverty amongst them. But the general trend was towards peace and prosperity. I think what's striking about this crisis is that all the big players may indeed lose. I think it's not been a good crisis for China, but it's not been a good crisis for the United States either. And the great danger for those of us who are neither Chinese nor American is that the two big powers retreat into, at best, firing volleys of rhetoric at each other, at worst, take risks with security and prosperity, whether on Taiwan or on trade. And that leaves the rest of the world feeling that there is no rudder on the global boat. And I think that that is a very worrying prospect. The Israeli author Yuval Harari has talked about the dangers of thinking about the world as networks of fortresses. And I think that in a connected world, that vision is a very dangerous one. It's one that promises impoverishment for those who are left behind, and also really dark conflicts, whether in cyberspace or elsewhere. So I think that Louis' question is right to raise the spectre of a very dangerous standoff. And I don't think it should be in anyone's interest to fuel that. OK,
well, on Louis' question as well, the other part of it, I want to put this to the ambassador. He says once investigations are underway, well, a core question then to China is does China accept its culpability, its responsibilities during this crisis? And will it, let me ask you straight up, will it allow investigators, independent investigators, onto Chinese soil to work out what happened?
Yeah, we certainly welcome international review, but the purpose is not to label any country. All countries that closely covered by the virus should be accountable. We support, together with 120 member states during a Health Assembly, that at a proper time, it is necessary, as any major pandemic, that it's necessary for international community to carry out review. The purpose to sum up experience, to get prepared better for the future pandemic. And this review first should be independent and should be, by independence, we mean is to be free from politicization, should be based on science. They should like the scientists to take the lead.
Well, who would you accept?
It should be
sorry to interrupt, Ambassador, but who would you accept then leading it? You have to deem it to be independent. Who would you like to see overseeing it?
WHO should lead this independent review. All countries should get involved, especially the major players, as they mentioned. Can I have a moment? I found I have differences with Neil. When he blamed China for slow reaction, that's not true. I think Neil got a lot of wrong information, including the one when he said that China, when Wuhan was at the lockdown and no flights coming out from Wuhan, but still many flights going to other countries. Not true. That's not true. That's a false information. When Wuhan was locked down, no flights at all, starting from 23rd of January. No flights, no trains, not at all. So with regard to how China react to this pandemic, China was the first country to report to the WHO, first to identify the paradigm, and first to share the genetic sequence with the WHO and other countries. China wasted no time to share information, to share our experience and containing the virus.
Okay,
and
Mary Robinson, are we heading towards this cooperation you've all been talking about and hoping for, or isn't the reality that this is fragmenting the world, that nations are turning inward, that nation states, and indeed, as Neil Ferguson was saying, many of those smaller nations that really aren't part of bigger operations have done better during the crisis? Isn't that then setting the tone for what the future looks like?
I think it's true that countries understandably want to protect their populations. So yes, the immediate thing is, what does it take to protect my country, my people, to get the ventilators, the PPE, etc. But we're actually seeing two things. I think we're seeing, certainly at the European Union level, a very significant move on the Green New Deal and on biodiversity. And I welcome both, because Green New Deal on its own won't get us there. The fund for just transition, all of this is new thinking that is going to shape our future. We need to come out of COVID-19 understanding the way we will align with dealing with the climate crisis. We must not go back to business as usual. It was not taking us in the right direction. And it was also symptomatic of terrible inequalities. And I think, as people are locked in their home, they're thinking of their families, of their loved ones, of their neighbors. And they're thinking of us as a humanity that is very fragile and needs to work together. I'm actually a bit distressed by the conversation we're hearing, because it's kind of political scoring goals, etc. I'm not into that. I think we actually need, more than ever, to move, because we have this other crisis, which is still the most important and worst crisis, the climate crisis. So we are not in a comfortable place coming out of COVID-19. We have to work together as a global community. We can't do it on our own.
OK, right. Well, I want to get some of our audience's reaction to what we've been hearing so far. So can I ask you, panellists, how many of you think that China should shoulder most of the blame for the pandemic? And second question, we'll get on to that in a moment or two, about the international system. First question, how many of you think China, just a show of hands, should shoulder most of the blame for the pandemic? I'd say that's just under half of you. Got a second question. How many of you then think it was a failure of the international system more generally? How many of you think it was a failure of the international system more generally? Let's get your hands up, please. Well, pretty similar number, maybe slightly more. OK, we'll hold that thought. We'll get our panellists' view on it in a moment or two, but we've got time now for another audience question. Let's bring in Eamon Daly, who's in London. Eamon, what would you like to ask this evening?
Yeah, good evening, Dermot and panellists. Post-pandemic, does the panel see an urgent need for reform of global institutions such as the UN, World Health Organization, and the European Union? Or are we likely to see an increased fragmentation between member state participants?
OK, Eamon, thank you for that. That really feeds into that question I asked about who our audience think have shouldered most of the blame for the pandemic. And the reaction there, David Miliband, I'm not sure if you could see it or not, was that I think more people thought it was a failure of the international system more generally. Therefore, to address Eamon's question, do these huge global institutions that have been around for so many years, and let's put the front two in the frame there, the United Nations and part of that, the World Health Organization, are they any longer fit for purpose?
Well, the World Health Organization is obviously part of the United Nations, and I think Eamon is absolutely right to say that we should start there. We're living in a world where 3 billion people have no access to running water in their own home. We're living in a world where 80% of fragile states, war-torn states around the world, are off track to meet the Sustainable Development Goals that aim to eliminate poverty by 2030. And I think that health provides us with the opportunity to build something better, to build something different, not just go back to a failing business as usual. What does that mean in terms of health? I'd put 3 things on the table straight away. First of all, we need a better, a more independent World Health Organization. The truth is its weaknesses reflect the fact that it's tied down by its membership structure. It needs to be more independent. Secondly, we need a better funded and more independently funded World Health Organization so that it's able to carry out its work without worrying what the member states who fund it will say. And thirdly, and I think critically, we need a World Health Organization that is more powerful, that is able to do independent inspections, that it's able to partner with the private sector more effectively, as well as with NGOs. And I think if we can get the reform of the World Health Organization right, it could set a template for a wider set of institutions that also need to be got right. It's the holes in the safety net that the World Health Organization needs to tackle, but it needs to be more independent, better funded, and more powerful to be able to do so. And obviously, that is not compatible with the kind of withdrawal doctrine that we're seeing from the US at the moment.
Indeed, and we'll get on to that in a moment. But Mary Robinson, as David Miliband points out, the WHO, of course, an arm of the United Nations. So more generally, does the same really apply to the United Nations in terms of David Miliband's prescription there?
I very much agree with what David was saying. And of course, the UN needs reform. I used to say when I served as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, quoting Winston Churchill on democracy, it's the worst system except for all the others. We don't have any other. And if we didn't have the UN, we would have to reinvent it quickly because the world would fall apart in so many different ways. But this is an opportunity, and I think that's really what I hoped we could talk about. We need now to understand that COVID-19, which nobody would have wished on the world, it is terrible, it's unequal, it's exacerbating inequalities, it's deadly. But it has broken a business as usual, which was not bringing us to a safe world. We have to remember that, was not bringing us to a safe world. So how do we come out of this? And we are seeing now much more thought. We're seeing opinion polls where the climate crisis at last is very high on people's agenda. We are seeing the IMF saying, stop support for fossil fuel subsidies. We're seeing investment, the big investment community saying, align your investment to the Paris principles. We're seeing a big move in the business community. We're seeing young people, school children and young people saying, we want you to listen to the science. Don't listen to us, we're only children. Listen to the science. All of this, to me, means we have to come out of this in a much, much better, more coordinated way that does understand the limits of the multilateral system, but also the importance of it.
Reform, though, the existing institutions. Neil Ferguson, given that analysis of the WHO and how it's performed during this crisis, does President Trump have a point? It's in China's pocket, and he's right to withdraw its funding by the United States.
Well, I can't agree with President Trump on this, because withdrawing the United States only increases the probability that the WHO will become beholden to China or one of the other great powers, because let's not kid ourselves. With all due respect to my old friend David Miliband, the international order set up after World War II was designed to be dominated by the great powers. That's why there are 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. And we shouldn't kid ourselves about some magical time of liberal paradise, because for most of the period after the 1940s, we had a Cold War. 2 superpowers duked it out, using the Security Council mostly to block one another. That era came to an end, of course, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we had a kind of interregnum, a period of US dominance that has now clearly come to an end, and we seem to be back to Cold War, only this time it's China in the role of the Soviet Union. And I have to take issue with something Mary Robinson said a moment ago. It is not politicization to ask for clear answers from China to the question, what happened in December and January? We need to know. We still don't know where this coronavirus first made the jump to humans, except that it was in Wuhan. But whether it was in a wet market or a laboratory, we still do not know. And to respond to something Ambassador Liu said, the reality, and it's clear from multiple scientific papers, including papers published by Chinese scientists, is that this virus was exported to the rest of the world from China through multiple airports in the course of January. And although flights out of Wuhan were restricted on the 23rd, flights continued from all the other Chinese airports, and they clearly transported the virus to Europe as well as to the United States and other countries. So I don't think it's politicization to say that we need to understand what went wrong, just in the same way that we needed to understand what went wrong when the Chernobyl nuclear power station blew up. Unfortunately, one-party states have rather a bad track record of precipitating enormous disasters. And the more power that those kind of countries have in the international system, I'm afraid the less the international system is really fit for purpose. So I think reform is urgently needed, and withdrawal is not the answer. But we must emphasize China's role in all this. And I was glad to see that what looked to me like a narrow majority of your panel agreed with me.
Yep. Well, we've got, as you referred to, we've got the ambassador here. So let's put some of those points to him. And centrally, the central charge there, from Neil Ferguson, you said that there were no flights out of Wuhan during the build-up and during the pandemic. But, of course, there were plenty of flights. There were hundreds of flights out of China as a whole. And the virus surely started circulating in the world like that. Now, you've got to admit that, haven't you, before the world's going to take you seriously?
I think his information is totally wrong. As I said earlier, that when we have Wuhan put in lockdown, there's no flight at all, no connection with outside the world. I'm very sorry to hear so many Cold War rhetorics from Neil. We know each other before, but I don't know why he is so interested in having a Cold War with China. I just want to let you know, China is not a former Soviet Union. You, being a historian, you really should have a serious study of China. I want to put aside, I can provide you with more information, more facts. We have this 24 reality check. I will mail it to you. I just want to say we shouldn't talk down the role played by WHO. We shouldn't, because WHO spoke positively about the efforts of China. WHO is a very important international organization, which has 120.
Just Ambassador, sorry, I just have to bring you back, to the Chinese responsibility. Undoubtedly, and we know this, that China was in denial about COVID-19 for so long, about animal-to-human transmission, about human-to-human transition. You didn't tell the world soon enough.
as I told you, we lost no time in informing WHO. This is a new virus. You have to be responsible. It's unknown to all of us. So you will need scientists to study in a responsible way and seriously. I think we identified this new virus 12 days after the first report. Then we immediately report to WHO and share this information with relevant countries. There's no cover-up, there's no delay. China's record is clean. It can stand the test of time and history. What I'm also saying, China first report the virus. It does not mean the virus originated from China. In terms of origin, I think it's up to the scientists to decide. Because as situation unfolds, we read many reports that some cases much earlier than China's first report, like the United States, Italy. We need to adopt scientific approach towards this matter.
What about that question, though, then, about reform of the World Health Organization? China would accept that?
Yes, of course. From this pandemic, it really shows the weakness of WHO, both in terms of its capability, also in terms of its resources, and also how WHO could respond more quickly, more effectively, especially taking care of the poorest, developing the weak countries. I think there's a reform, but we can do this after we claim the final victory of the virus. The top priority right now is to pull together, is to support the international, to support WHO, to lead this fight. We have not yet put this virus under control yet.
Okay, but you would support a reformed World Health Organization, right? We're talking, of course, about the pandemic, but that's not the only issue threatening the world, and it may not even be the most important. We conducted a wide-ranging poll for this programme of what the public thinks about the future. So let's share it with you. In our exclusive survey, we asked, looking forward, what is the biggest issue that the world needs to address? Now, take this in, because 33%, a third of those polled, said the environment and climate change were well ahead then of the 15%, less than half, who said preventing future pandemics. 14%, pretty close, said poverty. The rise of China as a superpower was the biggest issue for 11% of the people, and terrorism was the main concern for just 3%. So the environment there on 33%. Well, let's put that to some of the panellists there. And Mary Robinson, that's just what you were saying a little bit earlier there, and our polling supports that.
I take a comfort from that, because I think people in their homes, first of all, they've seen the air has cleared up in our cities. We can hear the birds singing. And somehow nature has reasserted itself in a way that people actually feel emotionally. And people want cities that are there for people, with public transport, cycleways, pedestrianisation, etc. And, city planners are beginning to really get this message. That's part of one of the ways in which we can move out. But actually, we need to just go green with investment, jobs, insulating houses and buildings, and also the biodiversity side, the rewilding, the understanding of our link with nature, the real need for the kind of support that young people in particular get, that Indigenous people have been telling us about for years. There's a lot of wisdom around, if only we'd listen to it.
Well, David Miliband, can we join up two of these findings then? That's on the environment and climate change. And then second place was those said preventing future pandemics was most important. I mean, and does it tell us what's happened during this pandemic, the reaction to it, that people only take things seriously when they happen? And that's too big a risk, of course, to take with climate change.
Well, I think you're making an important point that because climate change is long term, because in some ways it's invisible, it's a deadlier threat for governments to try and come to grips with. But I think that the real striking thing about your poll to me is how few people mention the global economy. I think in 6 months' time, there's going to be a lot of people who are worried about global recession. And here's the thing. Some people will tell you that that is a reason to ignore the environment. I would say that the drive for low carbon living, the drive to live as if there is one planet, not three, because at the moment we're 3 times exhausting the potential of the planet, that drive for a low carbon economy will be the great economic regenerator over the next 20 years if it's organized properly. And this debate about whether or not there's a choice between addressing the existential or the generational challenge of climate change, and on the other hand, addressing what I believe will be very, very severe economic consequences of the crisis, the fallout in developed countries, but also the fallout in developing countries. I think that it's absolutely key that we see these two problems together. And it's only by addressing them together that I think we have a chance of addressing both of them. That's true whether you're Chinese, whether you're British or American, but also whether you're one of the billion people living in Africa.
OK, plenty more to discuss on that, because the environment is also the subject of our next question from our virtual audience. And Sarah Lee, who is in Surrey. Sarah, what would you like to ask this evening?
Well, thank you very much, Dermot, and good evening. My question is, during the pandemic, we have seen a drastic fall in emissions. How can the world sustain that success by lowering the emissions from public transport, shipping, and air traffic?
OK.
Thank you.
Good question. Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. Well, let me put that to one of the world's biggest emitters of CO2. That is, of course, China, and the Chinese ambassador to the United Kingdom, Liu Xiaoming, who's here with us. What is China's commitment then to keeping up this temporary fall in emissions?
China is very much committed to Paris Agreement. China have completed its obligations 3 years ahead. In 2018, we have brought down the carbon intensity 45% from 2005. And also that we have also brought down the consumption of the carbon unit per GDP by 2%. And China now is the largest investor in new energy, in reusable energy, and China is very committed to climate change. China is supposed to hold a conference by the end of the year, biological convention conference.
Is it going to go ahead?
Pardon me?
Is it going to go ahead? That you're still planning to do it?
The date has not yet been finalized yet because of this pandemic, so it's still open. This year is supposed to be a year of collaboration of China, UK in environmental protection. Now UK have rescheduled your COP26 to next year, November. But we are still kept a very close contact online with my British colleagues, compare notes on how to make two conferences a great success.
Neil Ferguson, do we need a reality check on all this for at least this century? And certainly before that, we've been hearing all these words of encouragement on climate change. But people keep asking, in reality, where is the oversight? Where's the sanction for the transgressors?
Well, that's a good question, actually, because there isn't one. I worked out the other day that China was responsible for about 60% of all the increase in CO2 emissions since the birth of Greta Thunberg. And if you look at China's current energy policy, it entails building roughly one coal-fueled power station a week. In fact, one sign of China's very rapid return to economic normality is precisely the increased consumption of coal, which we can measure and is now above levels last year. So I think one has to, with all due respect to Ambassador Liu, acknowledge that fundamentally the ongoing problem of CO2 emissions has much more to do with China as well as with India and some Middle Eastern countries than it has to do with Europe or North America, where emissions really are declining The other thing I'd say by way of a reality check, and this goes right to the question that Mrs. Lee asked, is that as we acknowledge the birdsong around the cities and marvel at the clear skies, I hope we're going to realize that this reveals the trade-off. Yeah, we have reduced CO2 emissions and the skies have been clear over some very industrialized parts of the world in the early part of this year. But the economies have collapsed. Unemployment in the United States will probably reach Great Depression levels when the new number is announced this week. The collapse of economic output in all the major economies of the world is as bad as anything since the early 1930s. And this illustrates pretty clearly that there's a trade-off, that you can't actually drastically reduce emissions in the way that Greta Thunberg called for at the World Economic Forum back in January without some significant losses in employment and economic activity. It's just central to our whole discussion that we recognize that these priorities that you ask people about in your poll are interdependent. You can't just focus on one. At the World Economic Forum in January, all people wanted to talk about was climate change. And when I said, look, you should be much more worried about the approaching pandemic, people gave me rather funny looks. If you focus only on one of the issues, if you constantly emphasize the importance of climate change, you become myopic and you start to miss the other threats that are actually in some ways much more imminent than the threat of climate change. So the true answer to your poll actually is all of the above. We can't just focus on one of these things, and they're interdependent.
Certainly was a reality check there. We've got plenty of questions flooding in, so let's get on to them. Another question from our audience. Amanda Holland is in Hampshire. Hello there, Amanda. What would you like to ask?
Good evening, Dermot. So I'd like to ask the Chinese ambassador principally. This pandemic is a threat to the human race, not just to an individual nation. Those not in positions of power feel mistrust towards world leaders. How do the governments plan to work together better to protect the human race during world crises and rebuild that trust?
OK, rebuilding trust is the core of Amanda's question, but I also want to add into that. We asked about public trust in that exclusive after the pandemic poll that we've carried out. Let's show you that. We asked whether the coronavirus outbreak has improved or damaged the international standing of certain countries. And here's just some of the findings. 3% of those surveyed said China had improved its reputation. More than three-quarters said it had damaged it. Just 1%, though, said the United States had improved its standing versus 68% who said the United States had damaged it. Let's have a look at the United Kingdom. And our survey found that 6% of people thought the country's reputation had been improved. 43% thought it had been damaged. Well, straight to our panellists. David Miliband, let's talk about Britain first. Reputation clearly damaged there, as have so many other countries. But what do you see as the core mistakes made by the United Kingdom?
Well, I think the most important thing to recognise is that people are pretty smart, because that seems to me to be a very clear verdict on all three countries, where there were delays in all three countries at the beginning in coming to terms with the crisis. And then in the US and the UK, a really faltering response. I think that there are three elements really to this. We know if you don't get your testing going, then you don't know where the disease is. If you don't get your tracing going right, then you're not able to ensure that those who do have the disease are isolated. And if you don't get your public information, your public trust that the questioner referred to right, then your communications, it doesn't achieve the goals that are set. And so I think for the UK now, at a very delicate, a very difficult position, the priorities must be to get a testing system that people can believe in, because that's absolutely core to any kind of release from the lockdown. And we know that from other countries, you've also got to get your contact tracing right. I work for an international non-governmental organization working in war-torn countries. We know there too, testing is not enough, tracing is not enough. They're the absolute foundation of then the public trust that is essential.
Well, Ambassador Liu, part of Amanda's question was directly, she said, addressed at China. And I want to ask you specifically about rebuilding trust, about the race to develop a vaccine for COVID-19. And we know the advances that China, indeed so many other countries, are making. But if China were to develop an effective vaccine, would it be willing, and this is in terms of rebuilding trust, I suppose, would it be willing to share that vaccine with the planet as cheaply as possible?
Definitely. President Xi made a firm commitment during a World Health Assembly that, once the vaccine is available, China wants to make it a public good, make it especially accessible, available to developing countries. China now is among the most advanced countries in terms of vaccine research, and now we are in the phase 2. We already have 5 clinical trials, but we want to share with the rest of the world. In fact, China is also working with the UK, with other countries, including the United States, the scientists on the vaccine. I think I can't agree with the table you just showed that China reputation has been damaged. It really depends on where you get this information. According to the information I have, it's by the Edelman, the independent PR company of the United States. They have this World Parameter 2020. China enjoying the highest public support amongst people. It's about 82%, top among all countries. And also, according to the Singapore, a public opinion company, Black Box Research, they have had a survey of 23 countries. China, again, top the rest of the 23. The Chinese government enjoying more than 85% of public support.
OK, well, I want to see if you've got the support of our audience. I want to see what they feel about the question of trust now. So let's turn to you, panel. Get your arms ready again. Raise your hands. Here's the question. If you trust your government to do the right thing, wherever you are, do you trust your government to do the right thing? Wow. So about 5 hands in total there. What's that? About 10% of you. OK, how many of you trust Donald Trump to work with other countries to build a better future? Donald Trump. How many of you trust Donald Trump to work with other countries to build a better future? Well, and lots of shaking heads and no hands raised. What about the Chinese government? Same question. What do you think about the Chinese government, its ability to work with other countries to build a better future? Well, perhaps a dozen of you or so. So reaction from our panellists. And I want to go to you, Mary Robinson, because talking about the erosion of trust, I mean, quite telling there, wasn't it, there, particularly on that question about people's trust in their own governments. As I say, about 10% of our panellists felt any trust in them whatsoever. Is part of this, and you've been referring to it throughout the course of the evening, is a generational divide. We're seeing it on the streets of so many countries right at the moment, in spite of lockdown. Younger generations.
Yeah, I think that there is a very real uneasiness in our world at the moment because of the inequality and because of the inequities. And as David Miliband said, because of the kind of awful poverty that a large proportion of the world live in. That is not acceptable. It's not what we should be doing as a human race, concerned about our fellow human beings. We need to think deeply during this terrible shock to the system, which, as I said, has broken a business as usual, which wasn't going to bring us where we need to go because it was full of inequality. And so how do we actually build back better? We know how we build back better. We move dramatically to green deals, new Green Deal, biodiversity, nature-based solutions, investment that's aligned, companies that are aligned, and we do it in a way that has just transition for the workers in the coal, oil and gas. And I would hope, and I make an appeal to the ambassador of China, I hope that China would give us a leadership out of this that doesn't go the way of coal. I'm very sorry to hear of new coal plants in China, frankly, because you have an expertise in the wind and solar and electric vehicles. Go that route and help us all to go that route.
OK, well, Neil Ferguson, got to ask you about the other part of that polling. Donald Trump got no votes at all in terms of trust to work with other countries to build a better future. Of course, a general election coming, a presidential election coming. If that's the feeling, and it is among sections of his own country, should he be worried?
Oh, President Trump has plenty to worry about. For an incumbent to go into an election in the depths of a recession as bad as anything since the 1930s seems almost like a doomed enterprise. For an incumbent to go into an election with excess mortality comparable with deaths in the Vietnam War seems again like a doomed enterprise. In fact, if you were to listen only to the opinions of people in Western Europe and the UK, you would assume that this election was over, that Trump should simply throw in the towel the way Lyndon Johnson did in 1968 and let Joe Biden have the keys to the White House tomorrow. But I think if you take a closer look at the United States, you'll see that this ain't over. True, Joe Biden, the presumptive Democratic nominee, is ahead by about 10 points in a recent national poll, but you'll remember that national polls weren't a great guide to the 2016 election. And I think this great wave of urban unrest that we're seeing all over the United States in the past week is a reason to keep one's eyes very firmly on the coming months. It is, I think, far from over. And indeed, I think the rioters, and particularly those who engaged in looting, have unwittingly done President Trump a favor by changing the subject from COVID-19, where he was on a hiding to nothing, to some of the old questions that have bedeviled American politics for a very long time indeed. So I'm afraid to say that no matter how little confidence he enjoys amongst your panel, and I don't find that terribly surprising, you'd have got the same result in Germany, by the way.
All right.
I think the question of how Americans vote come November the 3rd is still open.
Okay.
And I think it's far from over.
I'm sorry to cut in because we are running out of time. Unbelievable, given the amount of time we've devoted to it. But I've got to ask the ambassador finally on this lack of trust, particularly with younger generations, where you are seeing that on the streets of Hong Kong and the Chinese state's repression of those protesters, those seekers after democracy.
No, it's not a Chinese suppression. What is going on in Hong Kong is violence. It's totally it's a risk to the national security. These perpetrators storm the parliament, the legislature, as we call it, and they even put on fire the innocent people. If the same thing happened in the street of London, if the rioters storm the UK parliament, what will be UK reaction? The UK government, police will sit back and let the things going on? I think any responsible government has to take measures. People did not realize that one country, two systems have achieved great success since Hong Kong returned to China 23 years ago.
I am so terribly sorry. We've run out of time. I can hardly believe it. First of all, I want to thank everyone in our audience for your questions and indeed for your voting. Thanks for taking part. Thanks as well to our panellists, David Miliband, Mary Robinson, Neil Ferguson, Ambassador Liu. Very good to talk to you all. Thank you very much indeed. So tonight we've learned that China would support an independent international review of the outbreak of the pandemic under the auspices of the World Health Organization and reform of the WHO to give it more power. And we'll have more world-changing ideas tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock. Do join us then for After the Pandemic, Our New World.